Chapter 13. A few months had transpired since the decision was made to make the voyage to what many were calling the West Indies. A faster route to India was the clear goal, but this voyage meant so much more to Hernan and Arturo. With their father's life having been snuffed out so senselessly, and since there would be no justice against his faceless murderers, the only thing which made sense to his two sons was to perform a grandiose gesture of love dedicated to their father. At least his memory would live on, even if he didn't. In the last couple of months, the two brothers had worked hard at preparing for the expedition. Much planning was done, and the two of them spent virtually every waking moment coming up with scenario after scenario. Each were discussed thoroughly, and decisions were made, one right after another. Early on, the two of them secured notebooks, allowing them to keep track of all the decisions and the endless lists of tasks to be completed. As weeks went by, plans for the trip really started to crystallize, and everything was coming together perfectly. Almost. The problem, if you want to call it that, was their respective wives. While Hernan and Arturo were completely invested in the effort and looking forward to the voyage, their wives were equally against the expedition. Under normal circumstances, both Sophia and Valera subscribed to the concept of maintaining a quiet, mild spirit when it came to interactions with their husbands. They weren't timid when it came time to make their feelings known, but for the most part, they both decided it was important to remain reasonably submissive to their husbands, who made it easy for them to behave in this manner. Both Arturo and Hernan had learned from watching how their father treated their mother. Diego always told his boys it was up to the man to treat his wife as if she was a precious and delicate vase, not only beautiful on the outside, but equally so on the inside. He taught them to treat their wives with the honor they deserved, and the reward would be a wife who deeply respects her husband. This was precisely the relationship Sophia and Valera enjoyed with their husbands most of the time. But, as is the case with all marriages, there were times when the bonds of matrimony were profoundly tested. This was one of those times. The village where the two couples lived had its share of men who had gone off to seek their fortunes at sea in the past. Hernan and Arturo were two of them. Most of them came back, but some didn't. The fate of that small minority weighed heavily on the hearts of the two women. They certainly understood the emotional aspect of what their husbands intended to do. This was a demonstration of their love for their father. They didn't want the ending of Diego's life to be as pointless as it currently seemed to be. For their own individual reasons, Sophia and Valera didn't like the lack of a legacy for Diego either. Sophia sincerely loved her father-in-law. So did Valera, for that matter. In Valera's case, though, she was sorry her small son, Joselito, never had the opportunity to meet his paternal grandmother, and now would never get to know his grandfather as well. Secretly, this broke her heart more than knowing the pain Diego's death caused her husband. On countless occasions, Sophia and Valera strenuously tried to dissuade their husbands from undertaking a voyage fraught with uncertainty. They tried everything from reasoning to anger to tears. Especially in the beginning, nothing even came close to breaking through the resolve the two men had in making this work. As time went on, the thick armor of resolve started to thin. Not enough for them to change their minds, but definitely enough for them to see the anguish this was causing their wives. This, more than anything, made the undertaking extremely difficult to complete. By the time they were ready to depart, part of what made them leave on that specific day was the realization that one more week would result in their resolve crumbling, and they would never go, which in their minds would mean they failed their father and, in effect, shamed him. They couldn't allow that to happen. Ultimately, though, Hernan loved Sofia, and Arturo loved Valera and his son Joselito. While their wives would never understand this, if they didn't go, the brothers wouldn't feel they were men their wives could respect. To maintain any level of self-respect, they had to go. Arturo needed to demonstrate to his son the resolve a real man must display and maintain. On the first night, after they left home, when all was quiet, Sofia composed a poem, Voyager, about her husband. Voyager. Eyes on the horizon, not all of you is here. You're on a voyage. You're gone, even when you're near. I'm happy where I am. You're never satisfied. You live in your own world, but now I'm so alone inside. Denied a lover's rage, an enemy with no face. Once again, I sleep alone. Once again, memories erase. In the morning, my eyes open, I stare at your pillow. My hand searches for warmth, but I'm left feeling cold. Arise, O wanderer. Another day makes its plea. Come home to me, voyager. Come find your peace with me. I'm giving more than you take. There's too much love to fake. You're making my heart break. You're making my love wait. I'm giving more than you take. I can't leave this to fate. Love me for our love's sake. These tears I just can't shake. You're a voyager. You're just a wanderer. Initially, the two men had a lot on their minds when they left home, so they let these things crowd out the fact they were already missing their wives and wishing they could be back home. Spending time thinking about Sofia and Valera would come later, once they were at sea. Of course, the first thing they had to do was secure a boat for the voyage. Their timing was rather fortuitous. When they started shopping for a vessel in Azores, they ended up buying out a defunct shipping company run by an acquaintance of theirs, which had two boats that fit their needs perfectly. As they were preparing for their voyage, both Hernan and Arturo thought back regularly to the first time they saw Azores. It was the same port village they gazed upon as boys, after being swept along the river, and later rescued by the Gitano people. That had a striking effect on the boys, since it was the first time they had seen the sea, and its mark on their young minds was indelible. As soon as they were old enough, they both left home and joined the crew of a shipping company, the same one which was now going out of business. When the current owner found out Hernan and Arturo wanted to buy a boat, he made them a deal they couldn't refuse. They ended up buying two boats for basically what they would have paid for one. While it ended up costing them more to fit out two boats rather than one, Arturo reasoned they would have twice as good of a chance to make it to the West Indies. Always being more impetuous than his brother, Arturo instantly wanted to jump on the deal. But it was Hernan who weighed the pros and cons and eventually relented to his brother's urgings. The next step was to secure the provisions and crew for two boats. Provisions were easy, only requiring making the purchases and getting them on the ship. The crew was a different matter. Many believed such a voyage was suicide. The general opinion was if you sailed far enough, you would either enter an area populated with great sea monsters, or worse yet, sail right off the edge of the world and fall forever into the unknown. They all seemed to have some uncle, cousin, or brother who had been that far and seen something which supposedly lent credence to such notions. In this rare circumstance, it was actually Hernan who pushed aside these ideas. It wasn't due to any brash decision-making on his part, though. Hernan was more devoted to his faith than most, and he applied several scriptures that talked about how God sits on the circle of the earth and hangs the earth upon nothing. From these and other scriptures, he just knew there wasn't an edge to fall off of, but rather a world something like his little nephew's ball. If he just sailed far enough, he would get to land on the other side of India. The only problem was they weren't sure how long it would take. Because of this, Arturo and Hernan decided to stuff the boats to the gunwales with as many provisions as would fit, and only take on a skeleton crew. With these preparations, the two of them calculated they should have enough to make a round-trip voyage twice the distance they had ever done before. Since any sailor worth his pay would never go if he knew the real destination, the two captains decided to engage in a little subterfuge. First, they made sure they didn't sign on anybody who knew anything about navigation. Hernan and Arturo made sure they were the only individuals who knew anything about how to use a sextant and observe the constellations. Second, during the day, they would basically sail south with the sun rising on their port side and setting starboard, as if they were sailing around the Cape Agulhas at the southernmost tip of Africa. During the day, they would only put up 1 or 2 sails, so they wouldn't end up getting very far. Night would be an entirely different story. The plan was to go full sail to the west. At night, the two of them would be awake, and during the day they would sleep. Both captains were extremely anxious to get underway and experience once again the steady rhythm of waves breaking against the bow of their ships. During the previous 3 months, Hernan and Arturo endured a lot of personal anguish, as the thought of their voyage was truly a daunting one. Before this, they were sailors themselves, but had never been very far out into the open sea. Most of their voyages consisted of stints on merchant ships sailing up and down the coast of Spain. They saw a lot of things many of their boyhood acquaintances never even knew existed. They had seen the marble edifices of Greece, the massive stone pyramids of Egypt, and the impressive rocks of Gibraltar. They went to the Holy Land, where their Savior himself had walked. They had been north to the coldest of the cold, and south to the hottest of hot. Arturo and Hernan also suffered the derision of their respective wives. Perhaps more than anybody else, Sophia and Valera were very unhappy with the decision to make this voyage. While knowing that once the decision was made it was final, still they valiantly worked hard to try and talk some sense into the minds and hearts of their husbands. They eventually failed at it. In the end, the only thing they took solace in was they had tried to dissuade their husbands from going on a trip which would probably lead to their deaths. They hoped it wouldn't come to that, but womanly intuition seemed to indicate otherwise. The day had finally come. There was no more planning to be done. No more checking or rechecking the seaworthiness of their crafts. Arturo oversaw the receiving of the last bit of provisions, and the crew had checked in the previous day. Arturo was to captain the Tyche, named after the Greek god of luck, and Hernan was to captain the Fortuna, named after the Roman version of the same god. Hernan was going over the crew manifest as well as making sure all navigational implements were properly stowed in his and his brother's personal quarters. The air on board was tense. Many of the men who signed on didn't know exactly what lay in store for them. The ship's stores were full, and all hands were present and accounted for. It was time. The twin captains flipped a coin, and the toss landed on Arturo to lead the sail. He put to sea, and Hernan followed closely after. They decided to use a series of flags for communications, 1 flag for each letter of the alphabet. They felt it was quite ingenious. Nobody had ever done anything like that before. Every voyage Hernan had taken part in before represented a chance to get out to the open sea, a place where he could become one with the wind and the water around him. It was a time when Hernan honed the simple skill of being comfortable with himself. Too many times he observed acquaintances who didn't seem comfortable in their own skin, almost as if they couldn't be alone with their thoughts. Unless they were dealing with some issue needing a resolution, or talking to someone, they somehow seemed to look for calamities to fix. To Hernan, this was a flaw, since it showed a lack of understanding of the world. Before one could be a real man who could stand on his own, he had to know the real person he was inside, and the only way to do that was to be comfortable with one's own thoughts. Usually, a voyage provided ample time to do this. Hernan quietly observed that this one seemed to be a little different. With this journey, there were more than the normal risks, causing more anxiety than he was used to. It wasn't because of the ships or his men. The ships were the newest type, recently made popular in Portugal by the fishermen there. The men? Well, they were good sailors, but even there concerns existed. Hernan knew he and his brother weren't forthcoming about the course they were going to take. The premise that he and his brother were the only ones who knew navigation was a house of cards which threatened to topple at any moment. The only way this could be staved off was to keep the small number of crew on board busy. Polishing every inch of the deck, or taking and retaking inventory were some of the ways. They did all they could to plan out each and every detail of the voyage. They spent dozens of sleepless nights covering each and every decision needed to ensure every contingency was covered. But how do you plan for the unexpected? Hernan and Arturo stocked as many provisions as they could possibly take, not knowing exactly how long the voyage would take. They expected to hit landfall, hopefully, in about 2 months, but that was only a guess. To allow for a point of no return of around 2.5 months, they decided to pack for a 5-month voyage and catch fish to eat while at sea. So it began. With a quiet resolve, the entire crew was on deck to witness the disappearance of land as they sailed farther and farther. Feeling the cool wind on their respective faces, Hernan and Arturo now faced time and unforeseen occurrences, courting whatever random destiny that might seek out their adventurous faces. It was now when the soundless demons of monotony reared their fearsome, ugly heads. It was now when the only thing remaining to keep them company at night was the memory of wives whom they deeply loved, but whom they abandoned in pursuit of a goal which was obscure at best. The two men were thinking identical thoughts as the journey began. They both were hoping all the sacrifice would be worth it in the end. Hey, fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters. If you have any questions about this or any other of my books, or if you want to know more about what it takes to write a novel like this one, please make sure you leave your question in the comments below. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.